In the year 1237, in a stone manor house nestled in the rolling hills of the English countryside, a mother named Beatrice guided her children toward sleep with tales passed down through generations, stories woven from folklore, scripture, and the rhythm of daily life itself. Welcome to this quiet hour of the night. I am honored to share this time with you. As darkness settles around us, we will journey together to a medieval English manor, following Beatrice through her evening ritual of storytelling. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, knowing that this story asks nothing of you but to simply listen and rest. Beatrice, 34 years old, moved through the upper chamber with practiced ease, her capable hands adjusting the wool blanket that covered her two children. The room held the warmth of the day's sun still trapped in the thick stone walls, and the single tallow candle on the wooden chest cast a butter-colored glow across the whitewashed plaster. The scent of beeswax and dried lavender hung in the air, mingling with the faint smell of wood smoke that drifted up from the hall below. Her daughter Margaret, 8 years old, lay beneath the covers with eyes already half closed, while her son Thomas, 6 years old, fought against sleep with the determination only small children possess. Beatrice settled herself on the edge of the straw mattress, feeling its familiar give beneath her weight. She smoothed her work-worn apron and let her hand rest on the rough wool of the blanket, the texture grounding her in this moment she had repeated countless times before. "Tell us about the saint and the wolf," Thomas murmured, his voice already drowsy despite his resistance. Beatrice smiled, a subtle expression of patient affection that softened her features. This was his favorite tale, one she had heard from her own mother in this very room when the manor had belonged to her father. She began in the traditional way, her voice dropping to a measured, soothing cadence. "In days long past, when your grandfather's grandfather was but a boy, there lived a holy man named Edmund who made his home in the deep forest." The words flowed like honey, unhurried and smooth. The candle flame wavered slightly in a draft that whispered through the shuttered window, creating dancing shadows on the wall that seemed to move in time with her story. Beatrice's storytelling held a particular rhythm, one learned through years of guiding children toward dreams. She paused between phrases, allowing silence to settle like falling snow. Edmund dwelt in a simple cell built of woven hazel branches, covered with moss and bark. The forest floor around his dwelling was carpeted with soft needles from the pine trees, and the air there smelled of earth and resin and green growing things. Margaret shifted beneath the covers, her breathing already evening out into the gentle pattern of near sleep. Thomas's eyelids grew heavier with each word, though he struggled still to keep them open. Beatrice continued, her capable hands folded now in her lap, her voice never rising above a gentle murmur. Each day, Edmund would walk through the forest, speaking prayers of gratitude for the birds in the branches and the deer that crossed his path. He ate only what the forest provided: berries in summer, nuts in autumn, roots he dug carefully from the earth in winter. The hermit asked for nothing more than what God saw fit to give him, and he lived in deep contentment with his simple life. The tallow candle sputtered softly, releasing a whisper of smoke that carried the familiar scent of rendered fat. Outside, an owl called once, its voice muted by distance and stone walls. The sound seemed to belong to the story itself, as if the world conspired to create the perfect atmosphere for sleep. Beatrice's voice took on a dreaming quality as she described the wolf's arrival. One winter evening, as snow fell silent and thick beyond his shelter, Edmund heard a sound outside his cella, low whimpering, pitiful and sad. He rose from his prayers and pushed aside the deer hide that served as his door, and there, in the gathering dusk, stood a great gray wolf. She paused, letting the image settle in her children's minds. Thomas's eyes had finally closed, though she could tell he still listened. Margaret had surrendered fully to sleep, her small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. The wolf's paw was pierced by a long thorn, and the creature limped forward, holding the injured foot aloft. Edmund saw no threat in the animal's amber eyes, only pain and a plea for help. The holy man knelt in the snow, heedless of the cold seeping through his rough woolen robe, and spoke gentle words to the wolf. Beatrice's own breathing had slowed to match her children's, her body relaxing into the familiar comfort of the evening ritual. The story unwound from her memory like thread from a spindle, requiring no effort, following its ancient pattern. "Be still, friend," Edmund said, and he took the wolf's great paw in his hands. The thorn was driven deep, but the hermit worked with patient care, easing it free with steady pressure. The wolf never moved, never growled, but stood as docile as a lamb while Edmund tended to the wound. When the thorn came free at last, Edmund washed the paw with water from a clay vessel, then wrapped it in a strip of linen torn from his own spare tunic. The candle had burned down to a stub, its light growing dimmer, warmer, more conducive to dreams. Beatrice barely noticed, so absorbed was she in the flow of the tale, in the peace that filled the chamber like water filling a bowl. From that night forward, the wolf never left Edmund's side. It slept across the threshold of his cell, keeping watch through the dark hours. It walked beside him on his daily prayers through the forest, moving as silent as shadow. When Edmund gathered wood for his small fire, the wolf carried branches in its gentle jaws. When the hermit knelt to dig roots, the wolf sat patient and still, waiting with the devotion of the most faithful companion. Thomas had surrendered entirely now, his breathing deep and even, his small body completely relaxed beneath the wool. Beatrice continued anyway, for the story had its own momentum, and she found comfort in the telling even when her audience had drifted into dreams. The years passed in this way, hermit and wolf living together in perfect harmony. The forest folk who glimpsed them walking together spoke of it as a miracle, a sign of God's grace made visible in the natural world. And when Edmund grew old and felt his time drawing near, the wolf lay beside him, keeping him warm through his final night. They say the wolf remained at Edmund's grave for the rest of its days, faithful even unto death. She let the silence settle then, thick and peaceful as the wool blankets that covered her sleeping children. The candle guttered once and went out, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight seeping through the cracks in the shutters. Beatrice sat motionless for a long moment, listening to the gentle breathing, feeling the stillness that had descended on the chamber. This was the gift she gave her children each night, not merely a tale, but a passage from waking into dreaming, a bridge built of familiar words and soothing rhythms. The stories changed from night to night, drawn from the deep well of oral tradition that connected her to her mother, and her mother to the generations that stretched back through the mists of time. When she finally rose from the mattress, moving with careful slowness to avoid disturbing the sleepers, Beatrice felt the satisfaction that came from ritual completed, from duty fulfilled with love. She made her way to the door, her work-worn hands finding the latch in the darkness without need of light. Tomorrow night would bring another tale, perhaps the one about the maiden and the singing spring, or the story of the monk who befriended a blackbird. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, her children slept peaceful and safe, carried into dreams on the current of an ancient story, just as children had been carried for hundreds of years before them, and would be for hundreds of years to come. Beatrice descended the narrow wooden stairs, her capable hands trailing along the cool stone wall for guidance in the darkness. Each step creaked softly beneath her weight, a familiar sound that spoke of countless journeys between the upper chamber and the hall below. The scent of wood smoke grew stronger as she moved downward, mingling with the yeasty aroma of bread that still lingered from the evening meal. The hall stretched before her in the dim light of the banked hearth fire. Embers glowed deep orange beneath a layer of ash, casting just enough illumination to reveal the shapes of the long trestle tables, the benches pushed against the walls, the dark beams overhead. The warmth wrapped around her like an embrace after the cooler air of the upper chamber, and she paused for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the deeper shadows. Her husband Walter sat near the hearth, mending a leather harness by the faint light of a single rush lamp. He was 41 years old, with strong, calloused hands that worked the leather with practiced skill. His graying beard caught the amber glow as he looked up at her approach, and he set aside his work without a word. This too was part of their evening ritual, this quiet time after the children had been settled into sleep. Beatrice lowered herself onto the wooden bench beside him, feeling the pleasant ache in her legs that came from a full day's work. She had spent the morning in the dairy churning butter until her arms burned with the effort. The afternoon had been devoted to the kitchen garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of herbs and vegetables that would sustain them through the coming months. The evening had brought the preparation of supper, the tending of children, the endless round of tasks that defined her days. "The old tale of Edmund and the wolf?" Walter asked, his voice low and rough like stone grinding against stone. Beatrice nodded, a smile touching her lips. Her patient nature showed itself in the way she folded her hands in her lap, content to sit in silence if silence was what the moment required. "Thomas fought against sleep as always," she said, her tone carrying gentle amusement. "But the story won in the end, as it always does." She watched the embers pulse with hidden heat, thinking about the power contained in those old tales, the way they had been polished smooth by countless tellings until they achieved a kind of perfection. Walter reached for the poker and stirred the ashes, releasing a shower of sparks that climbed briefly toward the smoke-darkened beams before winking out. Fresh flames licked at the edges of a half-burned log, bringing more light to the hall. The play of shadow and illumination created a sense of peace that settled over Beatrice like a cloak. "My mother told me that story when I was Margaret's age," she continued, her observant gaze nodding the way the firelight revealed the grain in the wooden table, the texture of the plastered walls, the hanging bundles of dried herbs that swayed almost imperceptibly in the warm air rising from the hearth. And her mother told it to her. I wonder how far back it goes. How many mothers have used those same words to guide their children into dreams? Walter grunted in acknowledgement, picking up his harness work again. His hands moved with steady rhythm, the awl punching through the thick leather, the waxed thread following after. The sound was soothing in its regularity, a counterpoint to the occasional pop and hiss of the fire. Beatrice let her mind wander through the treasury of stories she carried, considering which tale she might tell tomorrow night. There was the one about the shepherd boy who heard angels singing on the hillside, or the account of the blessed spring that never ran dry even in the harshest drought. She had stories of saints and miracles, of talking animals and enchanted forests, of poor cottagers who showed kindness to disguised angels and were rewarded with abundance. These tales served many purposes beyond the simple guidance into sleep. They taught lessons about virtue and faith, about the rewards of kindness and the consequences of cruelty. But they did so gently, wrapped in imagery and rhythm that made the lessons feel natural, inevitable, woven into the fabric of the world itself. Movement caught her attention as old Agnes, the household's longtime servant, emerged from the buttery carrying a wooden cup. Agnes was 67 years old, bent with age but still capable, her weathered face creased with lines that spoke of both laughter and hardship. She crossed the hall with shuffling steps and offered the cup to Beatrice. "Warm milk with honey," Agnes said, her voice crackling like dry leaves. "To settle you for the night, mistress." The scent rose sweet and comforting from the cup, and Beatrice accepted it with gratitude. The ceramic felt smooth and slightly warm against her work-worn palms. She sipped slowly, tasting the richness of the milk from their own cows, the sweetness of honey harvested from the hives kept near the orchard. The beverage spread warmth through her chest and belly, adding to the general sense of comfort that filled the hall. Agnes settled herself on a stool near the fire, taking up her own handwork, the eternal mending that was never truly finished in a busy household. "Did you tell them the wolf story?" Agnes asked, and when Beatrice nodded, the old woman chuckled softly. "Your mother loved that one as well. I remember her telling it to you, sitting right where you sit now, with the same tone in her voice that you use. It's like hearing an echo down through the years." Beatrice felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. She was part of a chain that stretched backward into time and forward into a future she would not live to see. Her daughter Margaret would one day tell these stories to her own children, and they would pass them along in turn, each generation adding their voices to the chorus. The hall had taken on a dreamlike quality in the firelight, the boundaries between shadow and illumination blurring until the space felt both intimate and vast. Outside, the night deepened, wrapping the manor in darkness broken only by starlight and the thin crescent of the waning moon. Inside, the small community of the household prepared for rest, each person moving through their final tasks with the ease of long habit. Walter finished with his harness and set it aside, stretching his arms above his head until his shoulders cracked. "I'll bank the fire properly before we retire," he said, rising from the bench. Beatrice watched him work, layering ashes over the coals with practiced care, ensuring they would hold their heat through the night but pose no danger of escaped sparks. Agnes had already disappeared into the small alcove where she slept, her mending tucked away for another day. The hall fell into deeper quiet, broken only by the settling of the fire and the occasional creak of timber adjusting to the cooling night air. Beatrice drained the last of her warm milk and set the cup aside. Her body felt heavy with the pleasant exhaustion of useful work completed, her mind already beginning to drift toward sleep. But she lingered for another moment, reluctant to leave the peace of the hall, the comfort of this quiet time with Walter. "Do you remember the stories your father told?" she asked him, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter paused in his work, considering the question with the same careful deliberation he brought to all things. "He told mostly of the old heroes," Walter replied, his strong, calloused hands resting on his knees. "Tales of warriors and battles, of courage and honor. They were different from your gentler stories, but they served the same purpose to carry us from waking into sleep, to connect us to something larger than ourselves." Beatrice nodded, understanding. The tradition of storytelling was not one thing but many, adapting itself to the teller and the listeners, to the time and place and need. What mattered was not the specific tale but the act of telling, the ritual of gathering at day's end to share words that had been shared countless times before. She rose at last, feeling Walter's hand steady her elbow as she found her balance. Together they climbed the stairs, moving through darkness with the confidence of people who knew every inch of their home. The upper chamber was thick with the soft breathing of sleeping children, and Beatrice paused at the doorway to listen, satisfying herself that all was well. Their own chamber lay beyond, a smaller room that held a bed frame strung with rope, covered with a straw mattress and wool blankets. The air here was cool but not cold, and Beatrice welcomed it after the warmth of the hall below. She removed her outer dress and kirtle, hanging them on wooden pegs driven into the wall, then slipped beneath the covers in her linen shift. Walter joined her moments later, his weight causing the rope supports to creak and adjust. They lay in companionable silence, both staring up at the invisible ceiling, both letting the day drain away into the night. "The children grow so quickly," Beatrice murmured, voicing a thought that had been circling in her mind. "Soon Margaret will be old enough to begin learning the stories herself, to understand that she must hold them in memory as I do, ready to pass them along when her time comes." "And she will do it well," Walter assured her, his voice already thick with approaching sleep. "She has your gift for words, your patience with the telling. The tradition will continue through her as it has continued through you." Beatrice felt deep contentment settle over her like a benediction. This was what mattered, not wealth or status, not grand achievements or recognition, but this simple continuation of life and tradition, this passing of wisdom and comfort from one generation to the next through the medium of stories told in the darkness. Her eyes grew heavy, and she let them close. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks and challenges, its own opportunities for work and care. But tomorrow was hours away, separated from this moment by the healing darkness of sleep. For now, she floated in the space between waking and dreaming, held safe by thick stone walls and familiar sounds and the warmth of another body beside her own. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the distant call of an owl, its voice carrying across the fields and through the shuttered window, a sound as old as the hills themselves, as timeless as the stories she told. And then even that faded, and there was only darkness and peace and the gentle pull of dreams. Morning arrived with the gradual lightening of the sky beyond the shutters, the darkness giving way to the soft gray that preceded dawn. Beatrice woke naturally, her body attuned to the rhythms of the household after years of rising before the sun. She lay still for a moment, listening to Walter's steady breathing beside her, reluctant to leave the warmth of the blankets, but knowing the day's work awaited. She dressed quietly in the dim light, pulling on her linen shift and woolen kirtle, fastening the ties with fingers that knew their work without need of full illumination. Her work-worn hands moved with practiced efficiency, smoothing the fabric, adjusting the fit. By the time she descended to the hall, the first birds had begun their morning chorus, their voices filtering through the gaps in the shutters. Agnes had already risen and coaxed the banked fire back to life. Flames crackled cheerfully in the hearth, and a pot of water hung on the iron hook, beginning to steam. The old woman moved between tasks with shuffling steps, setting out wooden bowls for the morning porridge, checking the bread in the wooden hutch, her weathered face peaceful in the growing light. "Good morning, mistress," Agnes said without turning, somehow aware of Beatrice's presence without needing to see her. "The hens have laid well this morning. I've already collected 6 eggs." Beatrice crossed to the hearth, holding her capable hands toward the fire's warmth. The hall still held the coolness of night, and the heat felt pleasant against her palms. She could smell the smoke, the earthy scent of the rushes scattered on the floor, the faint mustiness of stone walls that had stood for 3 generations. "I'll prepare the porridge," she offered, taking up the wooden spoon that hung from a nail near the hearth. Agnes nodded and continued her own work, the 2 women moving around each other with the ease of long familiarity. Beatrice measured oats into the steaming water, stirring slowly, watching the mixture thicken and bubble. The children would wake soon, drawn by the smell of food and the sounds of activity. Walter would need to break his fast before heading out to oversee the work in the fields, where the barley was ready for harvesting. The day would unfold in its predictable pattern, each hour bringing its appointed tasks, each task performed as it had been performed countless times before. Beatrice found comfort in this predictability, in the way one day flowed into the next like water following its ancient channel. Her patient nature appreciated the rhythm, the way each season brought its own work and its own rewards. Summer meant long days and abundant harvests. Autumn brought the slaughter and preservation of meat for winter. Winter itself was a time of indoor work, spinning, weaving, mending. And spring renewed the cycle with planting and lambing and the gradual warming of the earth. She ladled porridge into wooden bowls, adding a drizzle of honey to sweeten the taste. The steam rose fragrant and inviting, and right on cue, she heard small feet pattering on the stairs. Thomas appeared first, his hair tousled from sleep, his eyes still heavy-lidded. Margaret followed more slowly, rubbing her face with one hand. "Good morning, little ones," Beatrice greeted them, her tone carrying gentle affection. She guided them to their places at the table, setting the warm bowls before them. Thomas attacked his porridge with the enthusiasm of youth, while Margaret ate more delicately, still emerging from the fog of dreams. Walter descended moments later, his graying beard freshly dampened and combed. He took his place at the head of the table and bowed his head briefly in silent prayer before beginning his meal. The family ate together in companionable quiet, the only sounds the scrape of wooden spoons against bowls and the crackle of the fire. When the meal was finished, Walter rose and moved toward the door. "The barley won't harvest itself," he remarked, his strong, calloused hands reaching for the scythe that leaned against the wall near the entrance. Beatrice watched him go, nodding the set of his shoulders, the steady determination in his gait. He would spend the day in the fields with the hired laborers, cutting the golden grain under the August sun. Margaret helped clear the bowls while Thomas ran outside to play in the yard, his voice rising in some game of his own invention. Beatrice moved to the dairy, a small stone building adjacent to the main hall, where the coolness helped preserve milk and cheese. The familiar smell of sour cream and aging cheese greeted her as she pushed open the heavy wooden door. 3 large ceramic crocks sat on the stone shelf, filled with milk from the previous evening's milking. Beatrice skimmed the cream from the surface with a wooden ladle, her observant gaze noting the thickness, the rich yellow color that spoke of good grazing. The cream went into the butter churn, a tall wooden cylinder that stood in the corner. She positioned herself on the low stool and began the rhythmic work of churning, pushing the dasher up and down with steady pressure. The motion was meditative, requiring just enough attention to maintain the rhythm, but leaving her mind free to wander. She thought about the evening to come, about which story she might tell her children when darkness fell again. Perhaps tonight she would share the tale of the blessed well, the one where a traveling monk had stopped to drink and found the water so pure and sweet that he blessed it. And from that day forward, anyone who drank from the well was healed of whatever ailed them. It was a story her grandmother had told, passed down from even earlier generations, polished smooth by countless repetitions, until every word felt inevitable and right. The butter began to form, the sound of the dasher changing as the cream thickened and separated. Beatrice continued the work without pause, her capable hands maintaining the rhythm, her mind drifting through the repository of tales she carried. So many stories, each one a thread connecting past to present to future, each one serving as both entertainment and instruction, comfort and wisdom. When the butter had fully formed, she drained off the buttermilk into a separate vessel, then worked the butter with her hands, squeezing out excess liquid, kneading in a pinch of salt for preservation. The final product was pale yellow and smooth, ready to be shaped into rounds and wrapped in clean linen. Agnes appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on her walking stick. "The bread needs kneading, mistress," she said, and Beatrice nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. The 2 women returned to the hall together, where dough had been rising in a wooden bowl near the warm hearth. Beatrice turned the dough out onto the wooden kneading board, her work-worn hands pressing and folding, pressing and folding. The rhythmic motion was another meditation, another task that had been performed in this hall for generations. She imagined her mother standing in this same spot, working this same board, perhaps thinking similar thoughts about continuity and tradition. Margaret slipped into the hall and stood watching, her young face serious with concentration. "Can I help, Mother?" she asked, and Beatrice felt her heart swell with quiet pride. This was how the knowledge passed, not through formal instruction but through observation and participation, through the gradual absorption of skills and wisdom. "Come here, little one," Beatrice said, making room at the board. She guided Margaret's small hands, showing her how to fold the dough, how much pressure to apply, how to feel when the texture was right. The girl's hands were still soft, unmarked by the labor that would eventually roughen them, but they moved with careful attention, trying to mirror her mother's practiced motions. They worked together in pleasant silence, and Beatrice felt the moment stretch and expand, becoming something more than itself. This was not merely bread making, but the passing of tradition, the teaching of skills that would sustain Margaret through all the years of her life. And someday, Margaret would stand at this board with her own daughter, teaching these same motions, creating this same connection across the generations. The dough was shaped into loaves and set to rise again near the hearth. Beatrice wiped the board clean and returned it to its place on the wall. The morning had progressed, the sun climbing higher beyond the shutters, bringing stronger light and growing warmth to the hall. Thomas burst through the door, his face flushed from running. "Mother, there's a tinker coming up the road," he announced breathlessly. "He has a pack on his back and everything." Beatrice moved to the door and looked out across the yard. Sure enough, a figure approached along the rutted track that served as the manor's road, a hunched shape made bulky by the large pack strapped to his shoulders. Tinkers were welcome visitors, bringing news from distant villages, small goods for trade, and stories of their travels along the roads and paths that connected the scattered settlements of the countryside. She waited in the doorway as the tinker drew near, a man of middle years with a sun-browned face and clothing patched and repatched, until the original fabric was almost invisible beneath the repairs. He doffed his cap respectfully as he reached the yard. "Good day to you, mistress," he called, his voice carrying the accent of regions to the south. "Might you have work for an honest tinker? I can mend pots, sharpen knives, fix anything made of metal that's broken or worn." Beatrice considered, mentally reviewing the household goods. "We have a pot with a crack in the bottom," she said, "and several knives that could use sharpening. Come into the yard and I'll fetch them for you." The tinker settled himself on a flat stone near the well, unpacking his tools with practiced efficiency. Beatrice brought the damaged pot and the knives, and he set to work immediately, his hands moving with the sureness of long experience. Thomas watched in fascination as the tinker heated a small piece of tin over a portable brazier, then applied it to the crack in the pot's bottom. "You've come far?" Beatrice asked, her observant nature noting the wear on the man's boots, the dust that coated his clothing. "From Winchester Way," the tinker replied without pausing in his work. "Been on the road for near about 2 months now, visiting the manors and villages, plying my trade. I'll work my way north to the coast before winter sets in, then find a town where I can shelter through the cold months." "Have you news from the south?" Beatrice inquired. News was precious in the countryside, where days could pass without any contact beyond the boundaries of the manor and its immediate neighbors. The tinker launched into a recitation of events and gossip: a wedding in one village, a fire in another, the birth of twins to a merchant's wife, the death of an elderly priest who had served the same church for 40 years. Beatrice listened carefully, sorting the information, deciding what might be worth sharing with Walter when he returned from the fields. The tinker's hands moved steadily as he spoke, filing the edges of a knife blade until it gleamed sharp and true. "There's talk of a new stone bridge being built over the river near Salisbury," he continued, testing the blade's edge with his thumb. "The bishop himself has commissioned it, they say. It'll take years to complete, but when it's finished, travelers won't have to ford the water or wait for the ferry." Beatrice nodded, imagining such a structure. She had never traveled as far as Salisbury, her world bounded by the manor and the village church a mile distant, the market town 3 miles beyond that. But she liked hearing of these distant places, these grand projects that spoke of a world much larger than her daily experience. Margaret had joined them in the yard, sitting on the ground near Thomas, both children watching the tinker's work with rapt attention. The man seemed pleased to have an audience, his weathered face animated as he talked and worked in equal measure. "I passed through a village 2 days hence where they'd just finished building a new mill," he said, moving on to the second knife. "A fine structure with a wheel big as a cottage, driven by the stream. The miller was proud as a lord, showing everyone how the stones ground the grain to flour smooth as silk. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the yard until Beatrice could feel pleasant heat on her shoulders through her woolen dress. A breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of ripening grain from the fields where Walter worked. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed, the sound muted and peaceful. Agnes emerged from the hall carrying a wooden cup filled with ale. "For your thirst," she said to the tinker, offering it with gnarled hands. The man accepted gratefully, drinking deeply before returning to his work with renewed energy. "Bless you, grandmother," he said, using the respectful term for an elder woman. Agnes waved away the thanks and shuffled back inside, but Beatrice noticed the pleased expression on the old woman's weathered face. Small kindnesses mattered, creating webs of goodwill that connected stranger to stranger across the landscape. The tinker finished with the knives and held them up for inspection. The blades caught the sunlight, reflecting it in bright flashes that made Thomas laugh with delight. Beatrice examined them carefully, running her thumb along the edges with practiced caution, noting the sharp angle, the smooth finish. "Good work," she pronounced, and went to fetch payment from the small leather pouch where she kept coins for such transactions. The tinker accepted the copper pieces with a nod of satisfaction, tucking them into a purse that hung from his belt beneath his tunic. "Might you have a story to trade as well?" he asked, his tone shifting to something more speculative. "I collect tailies as I travel, carrying them from place to place like I carry my tools. A good story is worth as much as coin sometimes, especially on long, lonely stretches of road." Beatrice felt a spark of interest. This was an exchange she understood, the barter of narrative for narrative, the sharing of traditions that kept the old tales alive and spreading across the countryside. She settled herself on the stone bench near the door, considering what story might be worth sharing. "There's a tale my mother told," she began, her voice falling into the measured cadence she used for storytelling, "of a poor widow who lived in a cottage at the edge of a great forest. She had nothing but a small garden and 3 laying hens, and she survived by selling eggs at the market each week." The tinker sat back on his stone, his tools forgotten for the moment, his attention fully on Beatrice's words. Thomas and Margaret drew closer, even though they had heard this tale before. Something about their mother's storytelling voice commanded attention, drew listeners into the narrative's current. One winter evening, as snow began to fall, the widow heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found an old woman standing there, bent nearly double with age, shivering in the cold wind. The stranger wore only a thin cloak and carried no possessions. Beatrice's capable hands gestured gently as she spoke, helping to paint the scene. The yard around them seemed to recede, and the story became the only reality, wrapping listeners in its gentle spell. "Please, good mistress," the old woman said, "might I shelter by your fire tonight? The cold will surely kill me if I must sleep outdoors." Now the widow's cottage was very small, with barely enough room for herself, and her stores of food were meager. But she was a woman of kind heart, and she could not turn away someone in need. The breeze had stilled, and the yard was silent except for Beatrice's voice and the distant sounds of agricultural work. Even the chickens that normally scratched and clucked in the dirt seemed to have paused to listen. "Come in, grandmother," the widow said, using the term of respect. She gave the stranger her own seat by the fire and wrapped her in the only spare blanket she possessed. Then she prepared a simple meal of bread and weak pottage, giving the old woman the larger portion, though it meant she herself would go to bed hungry. Beatrice paused, letting the image settle. The tinker leaned forward slightly, caught in the tale's rhythm. Margaret's eyes had grown soft with the familiar comfort of the story, while Thomas sat very still, waiting for what came next. The old woman ate gratefully and settled by the fire to sleep. But in the morning, when the widow woke, her guest had vanished. In her place stood a beautiful lady dressed in robes white as new snow, with a gentle light surrounding her like dawn breaking over hills. The tinker's eyebrows rose, but he did not interrupt. Beatrice continued, her tone remaining steady and soothing, never dramatic or startling. "You have shown kindness to a stranger," the lady said, "and kindness shall be your reward. Look in your garden." Then she too vanished, leaving only the scent of roses, though it was deep winter. The widow went to her small garden, and there she found that overnight it had been transformed. Where before grew only common vegetables, now flourished rare herbs worth their weight in silver. Her 3 hens had multiplied to 30, all healthy and laying eggs of unusual size and richness. Beatrice let the conclusion settle gently, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. From that day forward, the widow lived in comfort, never wealthy but never wanting, and she never forgot the lesson that true riches come not from hoarding what little we have, but from sharing it freely with those in need. The tinker exhaled slowly, a smile creasing his sun-browned face. "That's a fine tale, mistress. I'll carry it with me and share it in the next village I visit. Stories like that one remind us of what matters most." He stood and began packing his tools back into his large pack, his movements efficient and practiced. Beatrice rose as well, brushing dust from her woolen dress. The exchange felt complete, balanced work for coin, story for story, the ancient patterns of trade and hospitality maintained. "Safe travels to you," she said as the tinker hefted his pack onto his shoulders. He touched his cap respectfully and turned toward the road, his figure growing smaller as he walked away, carrying his tools and his newly acquired tale toward whatever destination awaited him. Thomas ran off to resume his play, but Margaret lingered at her mother's side. "I like that story," she said softly. "The part about the garden transforming overnight." Beatrice rested her hand on her daughter's head, feeling the warmth of the sun-heated hair beneath her palm. "It teaches us to be generous even when we have little," she said. "That's a lesson worth remembering throughout life." They stood together for a moment longer, mother and daughter in comfortable silence, before returning to the hall where bread dough waited to be checked, and 100 other small tasks demanded attention. The morning had reached its midpoint, the sun at its highest, flooding the world with bright August light. Inside the hall, Agnes had set a pot of beans to simmer over the fire, seasoning them with a ham bone and fresh herbs from the garden. The rich aroma filled the space, promising a satisfying midday meal when Walter returned from the fields. Beatrice checked the rising bread, nodding with satisfaction how the dough had doubled in size, ready now to be baked. She shaped the loaves with her work-worn hands, placing them carefully on the flat stones that Agnes had heated in the fire's edge. A large clay dome was positioned over the stones, trapping heat and creating a makeshift oven. The bread would bake slowly, filling the hall with its incomparable scent. Margaret had taken up a spindle and was practicing the art of spinning wool into thread, her young fingers awkward but determined. Beatrice watched with patient approval, remembering her own early attempts at the skill, the frustration of broken threads and uneven thickness. Like storytelling, spinning was a skill passed from mother to daughter through observation and practice, through the patient repetition of ancient motions. The afternoon stretched ahead with its own rhythms and requirements. There would be weeding in the kitchen garden, eggs to collect from the hen house, water to draw from the well. There would be the preparation of the evening meal, the welcoming home of Walter from his labors, the gradual transition from day to night. And when darkness fell again, when the children had been fed and cleaned and tucked beneath their wool blankets, Beatrice would settle on the edge of their mattress and begin another story. Perhaps the tale of the blessed well, or maybe something different, chosen in the moment based on the children's mood and her own instinct. The stories were always there, waiting in her memory like faithful servants, ready to be called forth when needed. They connected her to her mother and grandmother, to all the women who had come before, sitting in darkness with children drowsy and ready for sleep, speaking words that had been spoken countless times across countless generations. This was her inheritance and her gift, this treasury of tailies that cost nothing and yet were beyond price. And she would guard them carefully, tend them faithfully, and pass them along when the time came, ensuring that the tradition continued unbroken into whatever future awaited. The bread released its warm, yeasty scent into the hall, and Beatrice smiled, content in this moment, in this place, in this life of simple work and ancient rhythms. The day unfolded as days had always unfolded, and would continue to unfold in the reliable pattern that gave meaning and structure to existence. The afternoon light slanted through the gaps in the shutters, creating bars of gold across the rushes scattered on the floor. Beatrice moved to the kitchen garden behind the hall, her capable hands carrying a woven basket for the vegetables she would harvest. The garden was her particular domain, a square plot enclosed by low, woven fences to keep out wandering chickens and the occasional rabbit. She knelt among the rows, feeling the sun-warmed earth through her woolen skirts. Her observant gaze moved over the plants, noting which carrots were ready for pulling, which onions had matured enough for harvest. The soil was dark and rich, tended carefully over years, fed with ashes from the hearth and waste from the kitchen. It smelled of growth and life, that distinctive scent of healthy earth that changed with each season. The carrots came up with gentle tugging, their orange roots emerging from the soil with clinging particles of dirt. Beatrice brushed them clean and laid them in her basket, working down the row with methodical care. Each vegetable represented sustenance for her family, each successful harvest a small victory against the uncertainties of weather and season. A beetle crawled across her hand, its shell gleaming iridescent green in the sunlight. She watched it for a moment before gently encouraging it to move onto a leaf. Her patient nature extended to all living things, even the smallest creatures that shared the garden space. The world felt large and generous in moments like these, when time seemed to slow and stretch, when each small action carried its own quiet significance. Margaret appeared at the garden gate, still holding her spindle though the thread had grown tangled. "Mother, I've made a knot I can't undo," she said, her young voice carrying a note of frustration. Beatrice set aside her basket and rose, brushing soil from her hands. "Bring it here, little one," she said, taking the spindle and examining the snarl of wool. Her work-worn hands found the end of the thread and began to work it loose, following its path through the tangle with practiced patience. The key is not to pull too hard. Gentle pressure and careful attention will solve most problems. The words applied to more than just tangled thread, and Beatrice hoped her daughter would carry the lesson into other areas of life. She freed the knot at last and handed the spindle back, rewound and ready. Margaret's face brightened with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Mother. I'll be more careful." The girl returned to her practice, settling on the bench near the hall door where the light was good. Beatrice watched her for a moment before returning to her harvesting, feeling that familiar swell of quiet pride mixed with tender concern. The world could be harsh, and she wanted to equip her children with all the skills and wisdom she possessed to help them navigate its challenges. The basket filled gradually with carrots, onions, and a handful of late peas still clinging to their vines. Beatrice added fresh herbs rosemary with its needle-like leaves, thyme that released its pungent scent when touched, sage with its soft gray-green foliage. These would flavor the evening meal and add variety to the simple fare that sustained them through the turning seasons. When the basket was full, she carried it back to the hall, pausing at the well to draw water for washing the vegetables. The well was deep and cold, its water pure and sweet. She lowered the wooden bucket on its rope, hearing the distant splash as it broke the surface far below, then hauled it up hand over hand, the rope rough against her palms. The water sloshed in the bucket as she carried it to the hall, droplets catching the light like scattered diamonds before falling to darken the dusty ground. Inside, she poured the water into a large wooden bowl and began washing the vegetables, her capable hands working efficiently, removing every trace of soil. Agnes had dozed off in her chair near the hearth, her weathered face relaxed in sleep, her hands still holding the mending that had occupied her before exhaustion claimed her. Beatrice moved quietly to avoid disturbing the old woman's rest. Age had earned Agnes the right to nap when her body demanded it, and there was no urgency to the work that could not wait. The beans simmering over the fire had begun to soften, their skins splitting to reveal pale interiors. Beatrice stirred them gently, adding more water and adjusting the pot's position on the iron hook to control the heat. Cooking was as much instinct as instruction, a feel for temperatures and timing that came from years of practice. Thomas burst into the hall with his usual energy, his face flushed and his tunic grass-stained. "Mother, I saw a heron at the pond. It was this tall." He stretched his arms upward to demonstrate the bird's impressive height. Beatrice smiled at his enthusiasm, her gentle affection for him showing in the softness of her expression. "Did you watch it catch a fish?" she asked, and Thomas nodded vigorously, launching into an animated description of the bird's patient stalking and sudden strike. She listened with half her attention while continuing her work, knowing that he needed to share his discoveries, that these moments of connection mattered as much as any formal teaching. The afternoon progressed in this fashion, each hour bringing its own small events and quiet accomplishments. The bread finished baking and was removed from its clay dome, the loaves golden and fragrant. The vegetables were prepared for the evening meal, chopped and ready to be added to the pot at the appropriate time. The hall was swept clean, fresh rushes scattered to replace those that had grown dusty and broken. Walter returned as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, his face reddened by exposure to the sun, his clothing damp with honest sweat. He carried his scythe over one shoulder and moved with the slight stiffness of a man who had worked hard since dawn. His strong, calloused hands left the tool by the door, and he crossed to the water bucket, drinking deeply before splashing his face and neck. "The barley is half cut," he reported, settling onto the bench with a sigh of relief. "Another 2 days should see the harvest complete if the weather holds." Beatrice brought him a cup of ale, and he drank it gratefully, his graying beard glistening with droplets. The family gathered for the evening meal as shadows lengthened, and the quality of light shifted from gold to amber to the first hints of purple dusk. They ate beans flavored with ham and herbs, fresh bread still warm from baking, cheese from the dairy stores, and the vegetables Beatrice had harvested that afternoon. The food was simple but nourishing, prepared with care and consumed with appreciation. Conversation flowed easily around the table, Walter speaking of the harvest's progress, Thomas sharing his observations of wildlife and adventures in the yard, Margaret quietly commenting on her spinning practice. Agnes had woken from her nap and joined them, her appetite modest but her presence valued as part of the household's fabric. When the meal was finished and the bowls cleared away, the hall settled into its evening routine. Walter tended to small repairs on tools and equipment. Agnes returned to her endless mending. Margaret practiced her letters on a wax tablet, forming the shapes with a wooden stylus under her mother's watchful eye. Thomas played with carved wooden animals, creating elaborate scenarios that he narrated in whispered tones. Beatrice moved between tasks, wiping down surfaces, banking the fire to burn lower, preparing the hall for night. Her movements had the quality of ritual, each action performed countless times before, each contributing to the sense of order and peace that characterized their home. The light outside faded completely, leaving only the glow of fire and a single tallow candle to illuminate the hall. Shadows gathered in the corners and stretched across the ceiling beams. The temperature dropped slightly, and everyone drew closer to the hearth's warmth without conscious thought. "Time for bed, children," Beatrice announced when the darkness had reached its proper depth. Thomas protested mildly but without real resistance, and Margaret set aside her tablet with a yawn. They climbed the stairs ahead of their mother, their small forms creating dancing shadows on the wall. In the upper chamber, Beatrice helped them prepare for sleep, removing outer garments, checking hands and faces for cleanliness, tucking them beneath the wool blanket that smelled faintly of the lavender she stored with the household linens. The tallow candle she had brought cast its uncertain light across the whitewashed walls, creating a space of intimacy and warmth within the larger darkness. She settled on the edge of the mattress, her work-worn hands folding in her lap, her body relaxing into the familiar posture of storytelling. The children waited with expectant faces, their eyes bright in the candlelight despite the drowsiness that would soon claim them. "Tonight," Beatrice began, her voice dropping into that measured, soothing cadence, "I will tell you about the singing spring." She paused, letting anticipation build naturally, unhurried. In the time of our grandfathers' grandfathers, deep in a forest much like the one beyond our fields, there was a spring of water that bubbled up from beneath a great stone. The story flowed from her like water from that very spring, smooth and continuous and clear. She spoke of a young shepherd who discovered the spring while searching for a lost lamb, of how he heard music in the water's babbling, notes that seemed to form a melody both ancient and familiar. Her patient nature shaped the telling, allowing each detail its proper weight and space. She described the moss that grew around the spring's edge, thick and emerald green, soft as the finest wool. She painted the image of sunlight filtering through oak leaves overhead, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted with the breeze. Thomas's breathing had already begun to deepen, his body surrendering to sleep even as he tried to hold onto wakefulness. Margaret's eyes had grown heavy, her blinks becoming longer, the gaps between them stretching. Beatrice continued anyway, her voice never wavering, carrying them gently across the border between waking and dreams. She spoke of how the shepherd returned to the spring each day, drawn by its mysterious music, until he understood that the melody was teaching him something: patience, perhaps, or peace, or the simple joy of being present in each moment. The shepherd learned to sit beside the spring for hours. Beatrice continued, letting the music wash over him like rainfall, letting it settle into his bones and change him in ways he could not quite name. The story unfolded with the gentle inevitability of dawn breaking, each detail adding to the atmosphere of tranquility that filled the chamber. Other shepherds noticed the change in him, Beatrice said softly, her voice barely above a whisper now. He no longer rushed his sheep from pasture to pasture, but let them graze at their own pace. He no longer worried about tomorrow's weather or next season's lambing. He had learned from the spring to live fully in each moment, to trust in the rhythm of things. Margaret had surrendered completely to sleep, her breathing deep and even, her small face peaceful in the candlelight. Thomas hung on at the edge of consciousness, his body utterly relaxed, but some part of him still listening to his mother's voice. Years passed, and the shepherd grew old, his hair turning silver as birch bark. But he never lost the peace he had found at the spring. And when his own children asked him the secret of his contentment, he would take them into the forest and show them the spring, letting them sit beside it and listen until they too heard the music in the water. Beatrice let silence settle over the chamber like falling snow. Thomas's breathing had joined his sister's in the slow rhythm of deep sleep. The candle flame wavered slightly, casting moving shadows that seemed to breathe with the children. She remained sitting for a long moment, reluctant to break the spell of peace that had descended. This was the culmination of her day's work, not the butter churned or the bread baked or the vegetables harvested, important as those tasks were. This moment of guiding her children into peaceful sleep felt like the truest expression of her purpose, her gift to them, and to the future they would carry forward. Finally, she rose from the mattress with careful slowness, her work-worn hands smoothing the blanket one last time. The candle she carried as she descended the stairs, its flame creating a small sphere of light in the encompassing darkness. Walter had already retired to their chamber, and Agnes had disappeared into her alcove. The hall lay quiet and shadowed, the fire banked to embers that glowed like buried jewels. Beatrice set the candle on the table and stood for a moment in the stillness, feeling the satisfaction of another day completed, another cycle fulfilled. She thought about the tinker who had passed through that morning, carrying her story of the generous widow to share in distant villages. Stories traveled like seeds on the wind, taking root in new soil, growing in ways their original tellers could never predict or control. Perhaps somewhere, years hence, a mother she would never meet would tell that tale to her own children. The words changed slightly by time and repetition, but the essential truth preserved. The continuity of it moved her deeply, this invisible web connecting storyteller to storyteller across distance and time. This preservation of wisdom and comfort through the simple act of speaking words in darkness. She was part of something vast and ancient, something that would continue long after her own voice had fallen silent. Beatrice climbed the stairs to her own chamber, where Walter's steady breathing told her he had already found sleep. She undressed quietly and slipped beneath the covers, her body grateful for rest after the day's labors. The darkness was complete, broken only by the faint suggestion of starlight beyond the shuttered window. Tomorrow would bring its own pattern of work and care. There would be more butter to churn, more bread to bake, more vegetables to tend. Walter would return to the harvest fields. Agnes would continue her endless round of household tasks. The children would grow imperceptibly older with each passing day. And when evening came, Beatrice would climb those stairs again, settle on the edge of the mattress, and offer another story to carry her children into dreams. The thought comforted her as she felt sleep approaching, that gentle tide that would carry her consciousness away into darkness. She had given her children many things that day: food and clean clothing and patient instruction. But the gift she treasured most was the one she gave each night. The stories that connected them to the past, that taught them how to live, that wrapped them in safety and peace as darkness fell. Her breathing slowed and deepened, matching Walter's beside her. The manor house settled into its own rhythms, timbers creaking softly as they adjusted to the cooling night air, mice moving in the walls with whisper-quiet footsteps, the wind sighing around the eaves. In the children's chamber above, Thomas and Margaret slept deeply, their dreams perhaps touched by images from the stories they had heard: a holy hermit befriending a wolf, a widow's garden transformed by magic, a shepherd learning wisdom from a singing spring. These tales would stay with them, becoming part of the fabric of their understanding, shaping how they saw the world and their place within it. Morning would come with its familiar arrival of birdsong and growing light. The household would wake and begin again the eternal round of tasks that sustained life. But for now, in the deep hours of night, all was stillness and peace, all was rest and restoration. Beatrice's last conscious thought was of her mother, long dead, but somehow present in the stories she had passed along, her voice echoing through Beatrice's own each time she told those ancient tales. Death could not sever that connection, could not silence those words that lived on through each new generation of tellers. And then even that thought dissolved, and there was only sleep, deep and dreamless and healing, holding her safely until dawn called her back to the waking world and all its gentle demands. The night deepened around the manor, wrapping it in layers of darkness and quiet. The stars wheeled slowly overhead in their appointed courses, as they had wheeled since time began, as they would wheel long after this small household had passed into memory and legend. Inside the thick stone walls, the family slept peacefully, each breath a small act of faith in tomorrow, each moment of rest a gift received and honored. The fire in the hall burned down to the faintest glow, barely enough to warm the stones of the hearth but sufficient to hold back the deepest cold. It would be tended again in the morning, coaxed back to flame, made to serve the household's needs for another day. But for now it rested too, conserving its energy, waiting patient and faithful in the darkness. Agnes stirred once in her alcove, shifting position with a soft groan, then settled back into sleep. Her dreams, if she had them, were private and unknown, belonging to her alone. The long years of her life had given her wisdom and weariness in equal measure, and she treasured these hours of rest as the blessing they were. Outside, an owl called from the direction of the forest, its voice carrying clearly through the still air. Another answered from the direction of the church, the two birds conversing in their ancient language. Small creatures moved through the grass and underbrush, hunting and being hunted, living out their brief lives according to patterns set before human beings walked the earth. The manor existed in this moment as a small island of human warmth and order within the vast darkness of the natural world. But it did not stand opposed to that wildness, rather. It existed in harmony with it, taking what was needed, giving back through careful stewardship, maintaining a balance that had sustained communities for generations. Beatrice's breathing was perfectly even now, her body completely relaxed, her mind at rest. Beside her, Walter too had found the deepest levels of sleep. His weathered farmer's hands curled loosely on the blanket, his face smoothed of the day's concerns. They lay together as they had lain countless nights before, as they would lie countless nights to come. Two lives joined in the simple partnership that made survival possible and gave meaning to the daily round of labor. In the children's chamber, Thomas murmured something in his sleep, words too soft and slurred to comprehend. Margaret did not stir, lost in whatever dreams occupied her young mind. The blanket rose and fell with their breathing, gentle as waves lapping at a peaceful shore. The candle Beatrice had carried upstairs had burned itself out, leaving only a curl of smoke and the smell of tallow. The darkness was absolute, but it was not frightening. It was the darkness that made sleep possible, that restored body and spirit, that prepared all living things for the demands of daylight. Hours passed, marked only by the slow turning of the stars, the gradual progression toward that moment when darkness would begin to pale, and the first birds would announce the coming dawn. But that moment was still far off, and the household slept on, held safe by thick walls and familiar routines, and the accumulated peace of generations who had lived and loved and told stories in this place. The night moved toward its deepest point, that hour when the world seems to hold its breath, when even the wind falls still, when time itself seems suspended between one day and the next. It was the hour when sleepers rested most profoundly, when dreams ran deepest, when the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin and permeable. Beatrice floated in that space beyond thought or awareness. Her consciousness dissolved into pure rest. Her body performed its necessary functions without need of her attention-breathing heartbeat, the slow work of restoration that happened only in sleep. She was at once herself and not herself, individual and universal, Beatrice of this particular manor, and every mother who had ever guided children into dreams with the gift of story. The manor house stood firm on its foundations of stone and earth, sheltering the sleeping household as it had sheltered others before them, as it would shelter others yet to come. Its walls held memories like the rings of an ancient tree, each generation leaving its mark, adding to the accumulation of human presence that gave the place its character and meaning. And in the deepest darkness before dawn, in that pregnant moment of perfect stillness, the manor and its inhabitants rested together, suspended in time, held in the gentle hand of night, waiting with patient trust for the return of light and the renewal of life's eternal rhythms. The first suggestion of dawn came not as light, but as sound a single bird testing its voice in the darkness, a tentative note that hung in the cool air before fatting. Then another joined it, and another, until the chorus built gradually into the familiar morning symphony that marked the transition from night to day. Beatrice woke naturally, her eyes opening to darkness that had begun to thin ever so slightly. She lay still for a moment, reluctant to leave the warmth of the blankets, but knowing that the household depended on her early rising. Beside her, Walter continued to sleep, his breathing unchanged, and she moved carefully to avoid disturbing him. He had worked hard in the fields and deserved whatever extra rest he could claim. She dressed in the near darkness, her capable hands finding each garment by touch and long familiarity. The chamber held the coolness of the night's final hour, and she welcomed the layers of linen and wool that would keep her warm until the sun climbed higher. Her work-worn hands smoothed her kirtle into place, tied the laces by feel alone, adjusted her head covering with practiced efficiency. The stairs creaked softly under her feet as she descended, each step announcing her presence to the sleeping house. In the hall, she found Agnes already awake and stirring the banked fire back to life, her weathered face illuminated by the growing flames. The old woman had likely slept less soundly than the others, age having stolen the gift of deep rest that the young enjoyed without thought. "Good morning," Beatrice murmured, her voice still soft with sleep. Agnes nodded in response, adding kindling to the flames with gnarled hands that knew exactly how much wood was needed, where to place each piece for optimal burning. The fire caught and spread, driving back the shadows, filling the hall with warmth and the comforting crackle of burning wood. Together, the two women moved through the morning tasks in companionable silence. Water was fetched from the well, its coldness shocking against sleep-warmed hands. The pot for porridge was filled and hung over the fire. Bread from the previous day was set out on the table along with cheese and the last of the butter Beatrice had churned. The sky beyond the shutters shifted from black to deep blue to the soft gray that preceded sunrise. Beatrice opened the hall door and stepped into the yard, breathing deeply of the morning air. It smelled of dew-wet earth and grass, of the distant fields where barley waited to be cut, of smoke from the newly kindled fire. A mist lay low over the ground, ethereal and temporary, burning off already where the first rays of sun touched it. She walked to the chicken coop, her footsteps leaving dark tracks in the dew-silvered grass. The hens stirred at her approach, clucking softly, ruffling their feathers in preparation for the day. She unlatched the door and they emerged in a rush of wings and noise, scattering across the yard to begin their endless search for seeds and insects. The nesting boxes held 5 eggs, still warm from the hens' bodies. Beatrice collected them carefully in her apron, cradling them against her body as she returned to the hall. These eggs represented sustenance and also potential trade goods, valuable in their simple way, a gift from creatures that asked only for grain and protection in return. Agnes had the porridge bubbling now, its nutty aroma filling the hall. Beatrice set the eggs in a wooden bowl and began preparing them for cooking. Some would be boiled for the morning meal, others saved for baking or trade. Her movements were efficient but unhurried, each action receiving its proper attention. Walter descended the stairs as the eastern sky bloomed with color, streaks of pink and gold announcing the sun's imminent arrival. He moved stiffly at first, his body protesting yesterday's labor, but loosened with movement. His strong, calloused hands splashed water on his face from the bucket by the door, and he ran wet fingers through his graying beard, smoothing it into order. "The barley waits for no man," he said, his voice rough with mourning. "I'll need to leave as soon as I've eaten." Beatrice nodded, understanding the urgency without needing explanation. The harvest had its own timeline, dictated by weather and ripeness, and farmers learned to submit to its demands or face the consequences. The children woke soon after, drawn by the smell of food and the sounds of activity. They came down the stairs rubbing sleep from their eyes, Thomas's hair standing in wild tufts, Margaret's face still soft with dreams. They took their places at the table automatically, bodies knowing where to go even before minds had fully engaged with waking. The family broke their fast together in the growing light, eating porridge sweetened with honey, fresh bread, boiled eggs still warm from cooking. The food fortified them for the day ahead, each person needing sustenance for their particular labors. Walter ate quickly, already thinking of the fields. The children ate with better appetite than the night before, hunger sharpened by a good sleep. When the meal was finished, Walter took up his scythe and departed, his figure growing smaller as he walked toward the distant fields where other workers would already be gathering. Beatrice watched him go, feeling the familiar mix of pride and concern that accompanied his leaving each morning. The work was hard and the sun would be merciless by midday, but it was necessary work, honest work, and he performed it with quiet dignity. She turned her attention to the tasks that awaited her own hands. The hall needed sweeping, fresh rushes scattered where the old had grown too compressed and dusty. There was wool to card for spinning, transforming the raw fleece into fiber that Margaret could practice with, that would eventually become thread, and then cloth. The kitchen garden required weeding, the endless battle against plants that grew where they were not wanted. Margaret appeared at her side, the spindle once again in hand. "Mother, will you show me again how to keep the thread even?" she asked, her young face serious with concentration. Beatrice felt her patient nature rise naturally to meet the request, and she took the spindle, demonstrating the motion, the steady pull, the consistent twist that created uniform thread. "Feel how the wool wants to stretch," she said, letting Margaret's hands join hers on the fibers. "You guide it, but gently. If you pull too hard, it breaks. If you don't pull enough, it stays thick and lumpy. The skill is in finding the balance." They practiced together for a time, mother and daughter working in harmony, the ancient skill passing from one generation to the next through touch and patience and repetition. Beatrice remembered her own mother teaching her this same skill, in this same hall, her hands covering Beatrice's just as Beatrice's now covered Margaret's. Thomas had gone outside to play, his voice occasionally drifting through the open door as he created elaborate games with sticks and stones. Agnes moved slowly about her work, conserving energy, doing what needed doing without wasted motion. The household functioned like a well-made tool, each person contributing according to their ability, each task fitting into the larger pattern of survival and comfort. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of morning mist, warming the stone walls of the manor until they released the heat they had absorbed. Beatrice worked her way through the morning's tasks with steady application, her observant gaze nodding what needed attention, her capable hands addressing each need in turn. She swept the hall thoroughly, gathering the old rushes into a pile that would be added to the compost heap. Fresh rushes were scattered to replace them, their green scent filling the air, their slight springiness pleasant underfoot. The transformation was subtle but significant, renewing the space, making it feel cared for and intentional. In the dairy, she skimmed cream from the fresh milk and set it aside for butter making. The remaining milk was poured into clean vessels for drinking or would be left to sour for cheese. Every drop had value, nothing was wasted, and she felt satisfaction in this careful husbandry of resources. The morning progressed toward midday, and Beatrice's thoughts turned to the evening that would inevitably follow. She considered which story she might tell her children when darkness fell again. There were so many to choose from: tales of saints and miracles, of talking animals and enchanted objects, of poor folk rewarded for their virtue and proud folk humbled by their arrogance. Perhaps tonight she would tell the story of the beekeeper who learned the secret language of his hives, who could ask the bees for their honey and receive it willingly rather than having to smoke them and steal it. It was a gentle tale, full of the drowsy hum of bees and the golden sweetness of summer, perfect for carrying children into peaceful sleep. Or she might choose the tale of the stone that wept, a strange story her grandmother had told, about a boulder near a forest chapel that shed tears whenever someone nearby felt genuine sorrow. The story taught compassion and the importance of acknowledging grief, but it did so with such tenderness that it soothed rather than disturbed. The choice would come naturally when the moment arrived. Beatrice knew. She would read her children's mood, sense what they needed to hear, and the right story would rise from the well of memory like water bubbling up from an underground spring. This intuitive selection was part of the art of storytelling, knowing not just the tales themselves, but when and how to deploy them for maximum effect. Agnes called her to the kitchen, where a problem with the bread dough required attention. It had risen too quickly in the warmth of the fire, threatening to collapse before it could be baked. Beatrice assessed the situation with her experienced eye, punched down the dough, reshaped it, and set it to rise again more slowly in a cooler corner of the hall. "You have your mother's touch with bread," Agnes observed, her weathered face approving. She could coax life from flour and water like a miracle. Beatrice accepted the compliment quietly, pleased to be favorably compared to her mother, whose skills she had always admired and worked to emulate. The midday meal was simple bread and cheese, cold meat left from the previous evening, fresh water drawn from the well. Beatrice ate standing at the work table, her mind already moving ahead to the afternoon's tasks. There would be no rest until evening brought its natural pause, its invitation to lay down tools and gather together in the firelight. Margaret had made progress with her spinning, the thread growing more consistent as her young hands learned the proper tension and rhythm. She worked with quiet determination, occasionally glancing at her mother for reassurance or approval. Beatrice offered both with subtle gestures, a nod, a slight smile, the gentle pressure of a hand on her daughter's shoulder as she passed. Thomas returned from the yard with news of a bird's nest he had discovered in the eaves of the barn. "There are 4 eggs in it, Mother. Tiny blue ones with brown speckles." His enthusiasm was infectious, and Beatrice paused in her work to share his wonder, asking questions that encouraged him to observe more carefully, to notice details he might otherwise have overlooked. "What kind of bird built the nest?" she asked, and he frowned in concentration, trying to remember what he had seen. "Small," he said finally, "brown with a cheerful song." She smiled, recognizing the description of a common sparrow, but she did not correct or lecture. The joy of discovery mattered more than precise identification. The afternoon heat built gradually, the sun reaching its peak and then beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. Beatrice worked in the kitchen garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of vegetables, her capable hands moving with practiced efficiency. The earth was warm beneath her knees, and sweat dampened her shift under the wool kirtle, but the discomfort was familiar and bearable. She thought about the tinker who had passed through the day before, wondered how far he had traveled since leaving their manor. By now he would have reached another village, perhaps shared the story of the generous widow with a new audience. The tale would take on slightly different coloring with each telling, adapted to local custom and the teller's particular style, but its essential truth would remain unchanged. This was how stories lived and spread, carried by travelers and traders, by pilgrims and wandering friars, by anyone who valued the power of narrative to teach and comfort and connect. Beatrice felt grateful to be part of this tradition, to serve as both preserver and transmitter of tales that might otherwise be lost to time. A bee landed on her hand, its fuzzy body golden in the sunlight. She remained still, watching it crawl across her knuckles before lifting into the air and buzzing away toward the flowering herbs at the garden's edge. The sight reminded her of the beekeeper story she had considered telling that evening, and she made a mental note to prepare that tale, to polish it in her mind so the words would flow smoothly when the time came. Agnes appeared in the garden gateway, leaning heavily on her walking stick. "There's a woman at the door asking for you, mistress," she said, her weathered face curious. "Says she's traveling to her sister's lying in and needs directions to the village of Ashford." Beatrice rose from her weeding, brushing dirt from her hands and skirts. Travelers seeking directions were common enough, and hospitality demanded she offer what help she could. She returned to the hall where a woman of perhaps 25 years waited, her face tired from walking, a small bundle of belongings tied to a stick over her shoulder. "Blessings on this house," the woman said respectfully. "I'm Edith, traveling from Winchester Way to help my sister with her first child. The road has been longer than I expected, and I've lost my bearings somewhat." Beatrice invited her to sit and offered water from the well, fresh and cold. The woman drank gratefully while Beatrice gave clear directions to Ashford, describing landmarks and estimating the walking time required. "You'll reach it before nightfall if you leave within the hour," she said. "Follow the track west toward the church, then take the path that branches north when you reach the old oak with the split trunk." Edith thanked her profusely and made ready to continue her journey, But as she stood to leave, she paused. "Might you have a story I could carry to my sister?" she asked. "She's frightened about the birth being her first time. Something to ease her mind would be a kindness." Beatrice understood immediately. Stories had power beyond mere entertainment. They could comfort the fearful, encourage the discouraged, provide perspective when circumstances seemed overwhelming. She considered what tale would be most appropriate for a woman facing the uncertainty of childbirth. "Tell her about Saint Margaret," Beatrice said, settling onto the bench and gesturing for Edith to sit as well. Her voice took on the measured cadence of storytelling, though this would be a shorter telling than the elaborate narrative she crafted for her children at bedtime. "Saint Margaret was imprisoned in a tower," she began, her patient nature shaping each phrase with care. "She prayed constantly, asking for strength to endure her trials. One night a dragon appeared in her cell, enormous and terrible, but Margaret did not flee or despair. She made the sign of the cross and the dragon vanished like smoke." Edith leaned forward, caught by the tale despite its brevity. Beatrice continued, her work-worn hands gesturing gently to emphasize key moments. "When Margaret's captors came to mock her, they found her peaceful and unharmed. She told them that faith was stronger than any fear, that courage came not from the absence of danger, but from trust in something greater than herself. And for this reason, women through the ages have called upon Saint Margaret when facing childbirth, asking her to grant them the same strength and peace she showed in her trials." She let the story settle, watching Edith's face soften with understanding. "Tell your sister," Beatrice added, "that countless women have walked this path before her, that her body knows what to do, that fear is natural but need not overwhelm. And remind her that on the other side of her trial waits the greatest joy a child of her own to love and nurture." Edith's eyes had grown bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, mistress. I'll carry those words to her faithfully." She rose, adjusting her bundle, and departed with renewed purpose in her step. Beatrice watched her go, feeling the familiar satisfaction of having offered help that cost nothing but might mean everything. Stories were gifts that multiplied rather than diminished with sharing, and she was glad to pass this one along to someone who needed it. She returned to her garden work, her mind still dwelling on the encounter. How many women had invoked Saint Margaret's name while laboring to bring new life into the world? How many had drawn strength from that tale of courage in the face of fear? The story had traveled through centuries, carried by voices like her own, adapted and refined until it achieved a kind of perfection. The sun continued its descent, the shadows lengthening across the garden. Beatrice finished her weeding and gathered a handful of herbs for the evening meal: parsley and thyme, sage and a sprig of rosemary. The scents clung to her fingers, sharp and clean, mingling with the smell of earth and growing things. Walter would return soon from the fields, his body weary but his spirit satisfied by honest labor completed. They would share the evening meal, the family gathering around the table as they had done countless times before. And then, as darkness claimed the world beyond their walls, Beatrice would climb the stairs with her children and offer them another story, another bridge from waking into sleep. The thought filled her with deep contentment. This was her life, simple, bounded, repetitive in its daily rhythms. But within those boundaries existed richness and meaning, connection across generations, the preservation of wisdom through the ancient art of storytelling. She asked for nothing more than what she had: a family to care for, traditions to maintain, stories to tell. Agnes was preparing the evening meal when Beatrice returned to the hall, her gnarled hands chopping vegetables with surprising speed despite their obvious stiffness. The two women worked side by side, combining their efforts to create a meal that would nourish and satisfy. A stew began to simmer over the fire, its aroma gradually filling the space with promise. Margaret was still at her spinning, the pile of finished thread growing slowly but steadily. Thomas had returned to the hall and was helping Agnes by fetching items she needed: a knife from the shelf, a bowl from the hutch, salt from the small precious store kept in a wooden box. Even at his young age, he understood that everyone contributed to the household's functioning, that no task was too small to matter. The rhythm of preparation was soothing in its familiarity. Beatrice moved through the tasks without conscious thought, her body knowing what needed doing, her hands performing each action with practiced ease. She set the table with wooden bowls and spoons, placed bread and cheese within easy reach, filled cups with ale drawn from the barrel in the buttery. When Walter finally appeared in the doorway, the sun was painting the western sky in shades of orange and deep rose. His face was weathered and tired, his clothing dusty from the fields, but his graying beard lifted slightly in what might have been a smile. "The harvest goes well," he reported, setting his scythe by the door. "Another day and we'll have the barley safely cut." They gathered for the meal as twilight deepened outside, the family coming together at the close of another day. The stew was rich with vegetables and seasoned with the herbs Beatrice had gathered, warming them from within. Conversation flowed easily around simple topics: the progress of the harvest, Margaret's improving skill with the spindle, Thomas's discovery of the bird's nest, the traveler seeking directions. When the meal was finished and the bowls cleared away, the familiar evening routine unfolded. Walter settled by the fire with his tools and repairs. Agnes took up her mending. The children played quietly, their energy winding down as the day released its hold on them. Beatrice moved through her final tasks, her mind already beginning to shape the story she would tell. The beekeeper and his humming hives, the golden sweetness of summer, the lesson about working in harmony with nature rather than against it. The tale felt right for this particular evening, matching the peaceful mood that had settled over the household. The candles were lit one by one, as darkness completed its conquest of the sky. The flames cast their gentle glow across the hall, pushing back shadows that gathered in the corners and beneath the heavy ceiling beams. Beatrice moved through the space with quiet purpose, straightening objects that had been displaced during the day's activities, ensuring everything was in its proper place before night fully claimed the world outside. Margaret stifled a yawn, her hand covering her mouth in a gesture she had learned from watching her mother. The spindle lay forgotten on the bench beside her, the day's work complete. Thomas had grown quieter as well, his earlier energy fading as his body recognized the approach of sleep. Even Agnes moved more slowly, her weathered face relaxed in the firelight, her hands working the needle through fabric with a rhythm as old as time itself. "To bed, children," Beatrice said softly, and they rose without protest, their bodies ready for rest even if their minds had not yet fully surrendered. They climbed the stairs ahead of her, their small feet creating a familiar percussion on the wooden steps. She followed with a candle, its flame dancing with each movement, casting elongated shadows on the plastered walls. In the upper chamber, she helped them prepare for sleep with the same careful attention she brought to all her tasks. Their outer garments were removed and folded, placed on the wooden chest that held their few belongings. She checked their hands and faces, satisfied they were clean enough for bed. The wool blanket was pulled back and they climbed beneath it, settling into the straw mattress with sighs of contentment. Beatrice positioned herself on the edge of the bed, her capable hands folding naturally in her lap. The candle sat on the chest, its light creating a small sphere of warmth and visibility within the larger darkness. Beyond the shuttered window, the night was complete, broken only by stars that wheeled in their ancient paths across the heavens. "Tonight," she began, her voice dropping into the soothing cadence that signaled the beginning of story, "I will tell you about Edmund the beekeeper, who lived in the time of your great-grandfather's grandfather." She paused, letting anticipation build naturally, her patient nature understanding that the space between words mattered as much as the words themselves. Edmund dwelt in a small cottage at the edge of a meadow where wildflowers grew thick and fragrant all through the warm months. He kept hives, 20 of them, made from woven straw and shaped like bells, each one humming with the busy lives of thousands of bees. Thomas's eyes were already growing heavy, but he fought against sleep, wanting to hear more. Margaret lay perfectly still, her breathing beginning to deepen and slow. Beatrice continued, her voice maintaining its gentle rhythm, never rising or falling too dramatically, creating a current that would carry them naturally toward dreams. Edmund tended his hives with great care and respect. Each morning he would walk among them, greeting each one by name, for he had named them all, just as a shepherd names his flock. "Good morning, honeydew," he would say to the first hive. "Good morning, golden light," to the second, and so on through all 20, never rushing, giving each hive its moment of recognition. She described the meadow in careful detail, the purple clover and yellow buttercups, the white daisies and pink wild roses that climbed the fence surrounding Edmund's cottage. She spoke of the sound the bees made as they moved from flower to flower, a low thrumming that filled the air like a constant song, peaceful and purposeful. "The bees grew to trust Edmund," Beatrice continued, her work-worn hands gesturing softly to illustrate the tale. "They knew his scent and his gentle manner. When he approached a hive to harvest honey, he never used smoke to drive them away as other beekeepers did. Instead, he would stand before the hive and hum." She demonstrated, a low melodic sound that seemed to resonate in the quiet chamber. Thomas's eyes had closed now, though some part of him still listened. Margaret had surrendered completely to sleep, her small chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Edmund would hum the same tune the bees themselves made, matching their frequency, joining their song. And the bees, recognizing one of their own melodies, returned to them, would grow calm and peaceful. They would allow him to reach into the hive and remove the honeycomb, taking only what he needed, leaving plenty for the bees to sustain themselves through winter. The story unfolded with the unhurried pace of honey dripping from a spoon, each detail receiving its proper weight and attention. Beatrice spoke of how Edmund's honey was famous throughout the region, prized not just for its sweetness, but for something else, a quality people could taste but not quite name, as if the peace and harmony of his relationship with the bees had somehow infused itself into the golden substance. People would come from distant villages to buy Edmund's honey, she said softly, and he would sell it to them in clay pots sealed with beeswax, but he would also share his secret. Respect all living things, he would tell them. Work with nature, not against it. Listen to the rhythms around you and match yourself to them rather than imposing your will. Thomas's breathing had joined his sister's in the slow, deep pattern of true sleep. But Beatrice continued anyway, finding comfort in the completion of the tale, in carrying it through to its natural conclusion. As Edmund grew old, his hair turning silver as birch bark, his movements growing slower with the weight of years, the bees remained his faithful companions. Even when his hands trembled too much to harvest honey, he would still walk among the hives each morning, greeting each one by name, humming his peaceful song. And the bees would emerge to dance around him, as if thanking him for a lifetime of kindness and respect. She let silence settle over the chamber like falling snow, soft and complete. The candle had burned lower, its flame smaller but still steady. Beyond the walls, the night was deep and still, the world at rest. When Edmund finally passed from this life, Beatrice whispered, though her audience could no longer hear, the bees mourned him. For 3 days they did not leave their hives, and their humming changed to a lower, sadder note. But on the 4th day, they emerged again and returned to their work, carrying on the patterns he had taught them that life continues, that work has meaning, that harmony with the world brings its own sweet reward. She remained sitting for a long moment, reluctant to break the spell of peace that had descended on the chamber. Her children slept deeply, safely, their minds perhaps touched by images of meadows and flowers and the golden light of summer afternoons. They would wake in the morning refreshed and ready for another day, carrying within them the subtle lessons the story had planted. Finally, Beatrice rose from the mattress, her movements careful and quiet. She adjusted the blanket one final time, ensuring they were covered and warm. The candle she carried with her as she descended the stairs, leaving the upper chamber to darkness and the soft sound of children breathing. Walter had already retired to their own chamber, and Agnes had disappeared into her alcove. The hall lay quiet, the fire reduced to glowing embers that pulsed with hidden heat. Beatrice paused to bank the fire properly, layering ash over the coals to preserve them through the night while ensuring no stray sparks could escape. She stood for a moment in the dimness, feeling the day settle into completion around her. Every task had been accomplished, every need addressed, every member of the household tended and cared for. Tomorrow would bring its own demands, but tomorrow was still hours away, separated from this moment by the healing darkness of night. The story she had told joined all the others in her mental treasury, polished slightly by this telling, ready to be offered again when the time was right. The tale of Edmund and his bees would stay with her children, becoming part of how they understood the world and their place within it. And perhaps someday, when Margaret had children of her own, she would tell them about the beekeeper who learned to sing with his hives, passing the story forward into yet another generation. Beatrice climbed the stairs to her own chamber, where Walter's steady breathing told her he was deeply asleep. She undressed in the darkness, her hands finding buttons and laces by touch alone, and slipped beneath the covers. The bed was warm where Walter's body had been lying, and she curled into that warmth gratefully. Her last conscious thought was of the bees in Edmund's meadow, their industrious humming, their golden honey that carried the taste of harmony and respect. And then even that image faded, and there was only sleep, deep and dreamless and restorative, holding her safely until morning called her back to the waking world. The manor settled into its nighttime stillness, each person and creature finding rest according to their nature. The household cat dozed on the hearth stones, soaking up residual warmth. Mice moved in the walls with whisper-quiet footsteps, living their secret lives in the spaces between human habitation. Outside, an owl hunted across the fields, its wings silent as thought, its eyes sharp in the starlight. The barley in the distant field stood waiting for tomorrow's harvest, the grain heavy on the stalks, ready to be gathered and stored against winter's need. The well held its cold, pure water, patient and faithful. The hens roosted in their coop, heads tucked beneath wings, dreaming whatever dreams chickens dream. And in the upper chamber, Thomas and Margaret slept on, their young bodies growing imperceptibly in the darkness, their minds processing the day's experiences, their hearts nourished by stories and love, and the simple security of a home where they were valued and protected. The night deepened toward its darkest hour, that moment when dawn seems impossibly far away, when the world holds its breath between one day and the next. But even in that deepest darkness, there was no fear in the manor, no anxiety or dread. Only peace and rest, and the quiet confidence that morning would come again, bringing light and warmth and the renewal of life's eternal rhythms. Beatrice floated in sleep, her breathing perfectly synchronized with Walter's beside her, two lives joined in partnership and shared purpose. Her work-worn hands lay relaxed on the blanket, temporarily released from their endless round of labor. Her face, lined with the marks of 34 years of living, showed peace in its sleeping expression. In her dreams, if she dreamed at all, perhaps she walked through meadows filled with flowers, listening to the humming of bees, tasting honey golden as sunlight, feeling the warmth of summer on her skin. Or perhaps she simply rested in the deep place beyond images and thought, where consciousness dissolved into pure restoration. The stars wheeled slowly overhead in their appointed courses, marking time with celestial precision. The moon had set hours earlier, leaving only starlight to illuminate the landscape. But inside the manor's thick stone walls, time seemed suspended, irrelevant, as sleep worked its healing magic on the household's inhabitants. And so the night continued, holding all of them safe in its gentle embrace, asking nothing, offering everything rest and renewal, peace and restoration, the precious gift of hours spent in darkness, preparing body and spirit for whatever the new day might bring. The first bird called again, its voice piercing the pre-dawn darkness with a single clear note. Other birds answered, their songs overlapping and interweaving until the air itself seemed alive with sound. Beatrice woke to this familiar chorus, her body responding to the signal that another day had arrived, bringing with it all its appointed tasks and quiet satisfactions. She rose and dressed as she had done the morning before, and the morning before that, her movements automatic and efficient. The chamber was cool but not uncomfortably so, and she welcomed the layers of clothing that would keep her warm until the sun climbed high enough to heat the stone walls. Her work-worn hands moved through the routine without conscious direction, freeing her mind to drift through thoughts of the day ahead. In the hall, Agnes was once again tending the fire, coaxing it back to vigorous life with practiced skill. The old woman's weathered face turned toward Beatrice as she descended the stairs, and they exchanged quiet greetings that required no elaboration. The comfort between them came from years of shared labor, of moving through the same spaces toward the same goals, understanding each other's rhythms and needs without need of constant speech. Walter appeared shortly after, his graying beard damp from washing, his strong, calloused hands reaching for the bread Agnes had set out. "Today we finish the barley harvest," he said, his voice carrying satisfaction mixed with anticipation. "By evening, it will all be cut and lying in the fields to dry." The family broke their fast together as the sky beyond the shutters shifted from gray to pale blue, then to the soft gold of early morning. Thomas ate quickly, eager to return to his explorations of the yard and its endless fascinations. Margaret was more deliberate, chewing each bite thoroughly, her observant gaze watching the adults around the table as if studying how they inhabited their roles. When Walter departed for the fields, Beatrice moved into the rhythm of her own work. The dairy needed tending first, milk to be skimmed, cream to be churned, cheese to be checked for proper aging. She settled onto the low stool with the butter churn, beginning the repetitive motion that would transform cream into butter, her mind free to wander while her body performed its familiar task. She thought about the story she had told the previous night, about Edmund and his harmonious relationship with the bees. The tale had felt right for that particular evening, matching the peaceful mood of the household and the season's abundance. Tonight she would need to choose something different, drawing from the vast store of narratives she carried in memory. Perhaps she would tell the story of the pilgrim who got lost in the forest and was guided to safety by a white deer that appeared at twilight. It was a tale her own grandmother had favored, full of soft imagery, dappled light through leaves, the quiet footfalls of the deer on moss-covered ground, the pilgrim's growing trust as he followed the creature through deepening shadows until they emerged at last at a monastery where he found shelter and welcome. Or she might choose the tale of the baker's daughter who showed kindness to an old beggar woman and received the gift of bread that never grew stale, that could feed multitudes without diminishing. That story taught generosity while also celebrating the simple miracle of daily bread, the staff of life that sustained bodies and brought people together around shared tables. The butter began to form under her steady churning, the sound changing as the cream thickened and separated. Beatrice continued without pause, her patient nature content with work that produced visible results through steady application of effort. When the butter was ready, she drained the buttermilk and worked the golden mass with her capable hands, squeezing out excess liquid, kneading in salt for preservation. Agnes called to her from the hall, and she went to find the old woman standing at the door, pointing toward the road. "Another traveler approaches," Agnes said, her weathered face curious. "A man on foot but dressed better than common laborers, perhaps a merchant or a clerk." Beatrice moved to the doorway and looked out across the yard. The figure approaching was indeed well dressed, wearing a tunic of good wool in a deep blue color, with leather boots that suggested means beyond the ordinary. He carried a leather satchel over one shoulder and walked with the confident stride of someone accustomed to covering long distances. As he drew near, Beatrice could see he was a man of perhaps 40 years, with dark hair threaded with silver and a face marked by intelligence and what might have been humor. He removed his cap respectfully as he reached the yard. "Good morning, mistress," he called in a voice that carried the educated accent of someone who had spent time in cities or centers of learning. "I am Brother Anselm, traveling from the monastery at Winchester to deliver documents to the priory near Durham. Might I trouble you for water to refill my flask?" Beatrice welcomed him into the yard and sent Margaret to draw fresh water from the well. Monks and friars were common travelers on the roads, carrying messages and documents between religious houses, and hospitality to them was both duty and honor. She offered him a seat on the bench near the door while he waited for the water. "You travel far," she observed, her tone carrying polite interest. Brother Anselm nodded, setting his satchel carefully beside him. "Many days' journey yet before I reach Durham," he agreed. "But the weather holds fair, and I make good progress. The roads have been kind to me thus far." He accepted the water Margaret brought with a blessing, drinking deeply before refilling his leather flask. "Have you news from Winchester?" Beatrice asked, mindful that travelers often carried information from the wider world. Brother Anselm considered the question, his intelligent face thoughtful. "The harvest there is progressing well, as it seems to be here," he said. "The abbey has taken in 3 new novices this season, young men seeking to dedicate their lives to prayer and learning. And there is talk of expanding the scriptorium, adding another room to accommodate the growing collection of manuscripts." Thomas had appeared and was watching the monk with open curiosity. Brother Anselm smiled at the boy's frank stare. "And what is your name, young master?" he asked gently. "Thomas," the boy replied, then added with enthusiasm, "I found a bird's nest with 4 eggs in it." "Did you indeed?" Brother Anselm's tone suggested genuine interest. "You must have sharp eyes and a patient spirit to discover such treasures. The natural world reveals much to those who pay attention." Beatrice felt warmth toward this traveling monk who took time to engage kindly with her son, who saw value in a child's simple discovery. She found herself asking a question that had been forming in her mind. "Brother Anselm, in your travels, do you carry stories as well as documents, tales to share in the places you visit?" The monk's face brightened with understanding. "Ah, you are a keeper of tales yourself, I think. Yes, I collect stories as I travel, much as I collect observations about the lands I pass through. Stories are treasures that cost nothing to carry but can enrich those who receive them immeasurably. Would you share one with us? Beatrice asked, gesturing to include Margaret and Thomas, who had drawn closer. My children love stories, and a tale from a traveler would be a gift indeed. Brother Anselm settled himself more comfortably on the bench, his posture shifting in the way of someone preparing to tell a tale. Agnes had emerged from the hall and stood listening from the doorway, her gnarled hands resting on her walking stick. I will tell you, the monk began, his voice taking on a measured quality that reminded Beatrice of her own storytelling cadence, about Brother Timothy and the robin that nested in the Abbey Bell Tower.